A long passage, but a good story. My favorite in all of the New Testament. Let us pray. God, there's something in us that makes us want to wander. Few of us remain faithful across the whole of our lives. There are circumstances and times in our lives when we turn away and we walk away, run away. And yet each and every time that we turn home to you, there you are waiting for us again. Not in judgment or in wrath, but in mercy and in grace. For those who still wander, Lord, quicken their spirits to return home. For that part of us that remains in some faraway place yet to return home to you, call that part of us home too. In Jesus' name, amen. How many of you have a stack of books or a list of books that are your favorites? Books that you would read time and time again, go back to over and over again, that you never get tired of reading, that you read and reread those, and no matter how many times you've read them, every time you read them, there's something new, some little nuance, some little detail that you missed, some relationship that you missed. The trilogy, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was like that for me. I'd read them, I couldn't tell you how many times before theology took over my life. One day I hope to read them again, and they will be as if I've read them brand new, because it would have been so long. I hope that for you, that you actually do have those kinds of books. These are your core books. And I hope somewhere in that list or that stack would be the Bible. The Bible has its own way of being a living document that, as it represents the Word of God, that in an infinite way, it can continue to open up and reveal something to us new about who God is, something about ourselves, something new about the relationship between us and God. One of my very, very favorite authors is a Dutch Roman Catholic priest, deceased now for a number of years. His name is Henry Nouwen. Some of you will know him. I have, since the beginning of January or so, at least on my personal Facebook page, I post a daily devotion from Henry Nouwen. He's one of my spiritual giants. Among those who trained me when I was at the 2 years that I was up in Nebraska, are those that trained under Henry. And so folks that knew him in his life, not only through his words, but knew him in person, and are able to take his spirit and help the spirit be with us. Henry is just one of those that if I knew that I was being sent to a desert island and could only bring 10 books or so, that one or two at least would be Henry Nouwen's books, I would probably do my best to try to stow away at least another 2 or 3. And he's just one of those folks that just has that kind of imprint on me. Henry, though extraordinarily well trained as a priest, he also was a counselor and therapist trained in Topeka, Kansas, of all places. Was on faculty at Harvard Divinity School. Best known for his last 10 years of his life in his service, where he served in a community, a very special community. It's part of a kind of a worldwide federation of facilities for the severely physically disabled and mentally disabled. Served as the pastor, chaplain at a community in Ontario, Canada. And though he was chaplain and pastor to the whole community, he spent his day in and day out life caring for one of the residents, a young man named Adam, who was severely, severely disabled, unable to speak, unable to provide his care. And Henry the priest did everything that was needed for Adam. And Henry would say, and said in his writings, that the friendship that he developed with Adam, that what he gained from Adam was much more important than anything that he was ever able to do. Henry, an author of over 40 books on Christian spirituality, known most for his humility. The concept of the book he's probably most known for is a book called Wounded Healer. It was a book that many, many pastors and therapists and counselors have read, because each of us who are therapists or psychotherapists, pastors, have our own past. We have our own spiritual wounds, the own emotional stuff that we've had to live with through life. And Henry's concept is that as we heal, it allows us to heal others. But it's a caution for those that, knowing that we have those wounds, that we never use those wounds in such a way that hurts those that we're providing our care for. So it's a cautionary book as well. And his intent is, I think more by design, is that the title really captures this concept of the always healing wounded healer who is always subjecting himself or herself to God's grace to make us whole as we work to make others whole. Here's a quote about Henry and the way that he used his own brokenness and his own struggles as a man and as a priest who had given himself into the life of celibacy. The way that he used his brokenness and God's grace to heal himself and others. The speaker said this about Henry, said, he knew instinctively that he could use his own humanness, his own woundedness in a way that would help ordinary people find grace. And I love this line. Henry now would help people find that great opening into the Grand Canyon that is God. A great way of thinking about it. Great just vastness that is boundless. That is God. That through his own brokenness was the doorway, the gateway. Well, like I said, if I had a list of 10 books, Henry would go with me, and the parable of the prodigal son, the book that we're going to be using over the next 6 weeks or so of preaching, would be a book that went with me. It's a book that I had hard copy of for a long time. I let somebody borrow it, and it's still off in a far country somewhere and has yet to return home. But it's a great little book, and we're going to use that book as sort of the basis of the series going forward. Now, the painting that you see, I've got to find a better rendition of that painting. This is Rembrandt's painting, The Prodigal Son. And the book, The Prodigal Son, this is the cover of the book. And the book essentially is Henry's reflections, these deep spiritual reflections that happened as he encountered the original painting as it still hangs in St. Petersburg in Russia. In fact, he was on his way back to St. Petersburg to speak of the book when he died of a heart attack. Rembrandt has his own telling of the story, and what he relates in the painting is not completely captured by the parable, but as a painter, artistic license. The primary image that you see here, and it's the one that's most important for us right now, and said I find better images that have greater detail. But what you see is the father in the red robe, and kneeling before him is the wayward son on his knees. The hands of the father on the shoulders, receiving his long-lost son on his knees, haggard and raggedy, broken, dirty, but home at last. Broken but wandering and lost no more. Son was back home. And so we'll use back and forth kind of the conversation between Rembrandt and now and the parable over the next couple of weeks. It's a familiar story. I don't know many people that don't know the story of the prodigal son. Even people that don't go to church know the basic concept of the prodigal son. We know the story of the son that goes off into the far country and lives a wasteful life. That's what the word prodigal means. It just means wasteful, the wasteful life. The son who went off into the far country and wasted the inheritance that he had. He squandered that. Is broken in body, mind, and spirit, is feeding the pigs, which for a Jew is the lowest of the low. Even the pigs have more food than he does. And in his, still at a place of manipulation, comes to himself, as some versions say, and realizes that he can never gain his inheritance back in his proper place with his father. But perhaps he could get hired on essentially as a ranch hand, as a farm hand, to work the land that the father has. At least he could get food and a place on the floor. And so he returns home. And the beauty of this story, and we'll explore this in greater detail, is he comes home expecting the full consequences of his actions. See, what we miss as 21st century American Gentiles is a part of the story that every first century Jew would have understood when Jesus told the story. For a son to get his inheritance, the only way to get your inheritance from a parent is the parent has to die. Well, he didn't want to wait till his father died. He wanted his inheritance now. So essentially what he did in declaring his need and his desire for his inheritance now, the only way to do that was the equivalent of spiritual murder. He spiritually murdered his relationship with his father, spiritually killed his father. And the father loved him enough to give him his inheritance in his life, an inheritance that should only have been his upon the death of the father. So there's much, much more to the story than simply father writing him a check. He destroyed a relationship. And so that's why he had no expectation, having murdered his father, that his father would ever do anything but give him the full consequences that were actually due. So he comes expecting the wrath of the father, the judgment, the condemnation, and the full consequences of his actions. Not only as he would have received within his family, but coming back home and whatever that community would have been, the shame that he would have felt and the shame that this would be bringing back to the family, all of that would be brought to bear on this young man coming home. But as severe as that cost would be, the need for shelter and the need for food drove him home. But instead of condemnation, what we know is the son received unearned, unmerited, and very unexpected grace from the loving father. The father who loved him not only enough to let him go, but the father who loved him enough to welcome him home. We know that basically in the story that the father metaphorically represents God, and that the son represents us, each of us in our own journeys of coming home to the Father. And some of you have great stories of coming home, of having been away and coming home. Many of us, in some form or fashion, especially around the college years, when we are in the process of rejecting our parents' faith and our parents' church, and the exploration sometimes happens in our early ages. But most of us, having been given a home to begin with, have something to come home to. It's a big part of the story. So the son's returned home from his time of living that wasteful life in the far country. His only expectation, his only real hope was to get hired on as a hired hand. But instead of getting him out on the floor with the other workers, the father gives him the ring, and the ring is the family ring that restores him to his place. He gives him his inheritance back. Whatever this value and worth of the estate was by the time the son comes back, the son has been given access to that inheritance again. The best robes, the best sandals for his feet, and the sacrifice of the fatted calf, a welcome home party. There we see the beauty of the story and the image of a father, a loving father who doesn't sit in condemnation, standing in condemnation, waiting for the son to come grovel. It's also part of the story that we miss. As a man of standing, as a man of worth in this community, and just as the patriarch of the family, and as the rules were, the social rules of society then, he would have stayed in the house. And the son would have had to come all the way to the house and then begged at the door and come and grovel for whatever mercy the father would be willing to offer. But that's not the image that we have. It's the image of a father who had been long looking for a son. And as it says, as Hunter read, when the son was a long way off, the father saw him. It says he gathered up his dignity and then ran. And rather than judgment, rather than requiring his son to live in the state of disgrace and shame. He offered him restoration, redemption, and wholeness. Powerful, powerful image. But the story of the prodigal son is that there's two sons. There's two brothers. And when we understand that the word prodigal means wasteful, what we understand is that each brother in his own way is a prodigal son. The one younger son that the story is mostly about is the son who took the wealth and squandered it, wasted the wealth, wasted his youthfulness, wasted his opportunities in a far country with wine, women, and song. But what we know about the older brother is that he was also wasteful in his own way. Wasteful in the sense that all that the father had to offer, all of the grace, all the wealth and value, the son who had been loyal, who had never left, had never gone, had never questioned or judged his father, also never understood the value of the father, never gained the full benefit. So he wasted his place. He wasted all of those years of opportunities when he could have had the fullness of the Father. As he wasted his life living a life of joyless obedience. And we see that in the church. Joyless obedience. Following rules. And I'm looking for anybody else in the church that's breaking the rules. Because if you break a rule, you can't be part of this. In my threshold class that I taught, we started Wednesday night. One of the exercises that we do is we talk about journeys. For a lot of people, especially some folks who are new to the Methodist Church, come from traditions where there was no language of journey of faith. It's about being saved and not losing your salvation. If you've lost your salvation, then gaining your salvation back. But the true transformational journey of faith is not a part of all denominational experiences. So as we introduce ourselves, we list, I have everybody list all of the denominational experiences that they've had. So we had 20 people in the class. We had between 45 and 50 different denominations listed on the whiteboard by the end of the class. That means that those of you who are sitting here, the same thing would happen if we went around and asked you, name all the churches and denominations you've been in, or other faith experiences that have influenced and affected your understanding of who God is. It would be stunning, the number of those backgrounds. And for some of you, as it was for me, the God that I grew up with was a wrathful, vengeful, mean-spirited, ready to send you know where. And only because of the blood of Jesus, the only reason I wasn't already in hell. It took a long time to come back around and find a different God, one that was a whole lot easier to believe in and participate with. Our churches are full of prodigals, those who've gone away and come back, but those who never gained the full benefit of the presence of all that God has to offer. And that in large part is the fault of the church and pastoral leadership. It's not your fault as much as it is those who stand in pulpits. So much of what Nouwen says needs to be heard in his own words. There are some times when pastors, often as pastors, even those who are extraordinarily eloquent and articulate, there are simply times when we come across writings and sayings and passages that just need to be heard in the original author's voice. So I want to talk a little bit and share a little bit out of the book. I want you to hear Nouwen's own words. He was older in life when he encountered the painting and had an opportunity to go and sit with it in private there in St. Petersburg for a long time, and the relationship that he developed and as it became this great gateway to him to God's grace, and he realized so much of what he had spent his whole life looking for, he had been looking in the wrong place. These are his words. Now it says, "The more that I spoke of the prodigal son," meaning the painting, "the more I came to see it as somehow my personal painting." That was me. The painting that contained not only the heart of the story that God wants to tell me, but as a priest, also the heart of the story that I want to tell God and God's people about God. All of the gospel is here, Henry says. All of the gospel is in this one painting. All of my life is in this one painting. All of the lives of my friends are there. The painting has become a mysterious window through which I can step into the kingdom of God. It is like a huge gate, a threshold that allows me to move to the other side of existence and look from there back into the odd assortment of people and events that make up my daily life. Now it says, for many years I tried to get a glimpse of God by looking carefully at the varieties of the human experience as a psychotherapist, as a trained counselor, always looking into the brokenness of others trying to find God. I looked carefully at the varieties of human experiences, loneliness and love, sorrow and joy, resentment and gratitude, war and peace. I sought to understand the ups and the downs of the human soul, to discern there in the lives of others a hunger and thirst that only a God whose name is love could satisfy. I tried to discover the lasting beyond the passing, the eternal beyond the temporal, the perfect love beyond all paralyzing fears, and the divine consolation beyond the desolation of human anguish and agony. I tried constantly to point beyond the mortal quality of our existence to the presence of a larger, deeper, wider, and more beautiful presence than we can imagine, and to speak about that presence as a presence that can already now be seen, heard, and touched by those who are simply just willing to believe. And this is where the turn comes from now on, and it's our turn. I have now been led to an inner place that I had not known before. It is a place within me where God has chosen to dwell. It is a place where I am held safe in the embrace of an all-loving Father who calls me by name and says, "You are my beloved child, and on you my favor rests." It is the place where I can taste the joy and the peace that are not of this world. This place has always been there. This place has always been there. There's never been a time in my life when that place wasn't there. It's always been there. I had always been aware of it as a source of grace, but I had not been able to enter it and truly live there. I only saw it as a place where something came out of, never saw it as a place where he could enter into. Jesus says, "Anyone who loves me will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we shall come to him and make our home in him." These words have always impressed me deeply. I am God's home, Henry Nouwen says. Me, I am God's home. And when he says that about himself, he's saying that about each of us. That each of you is God's home. But it had always been so very hard to experience the truth of these words. Yes, God dwells in my innermost being, but how could I accept Jesus' call to make your home in me as I make my home in you? But the invitation is clear and unambiguous to make my home where God has made his. This is the great spiritual challenge. It seems an impossible task. For the God who took up residence in our soul before we had a soul, to not be looking out there for God, but to be looking here. And to enter into that holy place the same way that we enter into this sanctuary on Sunday mornings. We simply open a door and walk through, and there is God. And we expect God to be located somewhere. And Henry's saying, yes, he is located somewhere, but it's not out there. It's not just in here, but it's here. So what Nouwen concluded is what is so powerful, that in the parable of the prodigal son, the son who represents us returns home to the father who represents God. But in his deepest reflection of all, not only did Nowan discover how to return home to God, but most importantly, Nowan finally realized this eternal truth with absolute clarity, that not only was God Nowan's home, that Nowan himself, as are we, also God's home. We don't have to look out there to find God. As a church, when we are best at what we do, as a church, when we welcome a stranger to the door, all strangers have a story. As you've heard me say before, Susan and I were talking about it last night. Lynn Tyler had posted something on Facebook, and I posted this back as the version that I say it, is that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. Every saint has a past. Every sinner has a future. When someone walks to our door, they are both saint and sinner, both with a past, both with a future. But they're also represented on some version of the prodigal son, when we just are one of, perhaps the other brother. We don't know which one it is. We don't know which of the two wasteful brothers it is. It may have been the wasteful brother that had truly gone off and lived, and perhaps still is in that far country, the far country that's sometimes in the world we live in today, the far country of poverty, the far country of mental health issues, the far country that's associated with addictive illnesses. Sometimes those folks come home and find the grace that restores them and redeems them and makes them whole again. But sometimes the stranger that knocks on their door is a case of another older brother who'd been part of the church their whole life but had never known joy. We had a stranger in church this morning who left about the time that we started lighting the candles. He was a Pentecostal preacher. On sabbatical, thought he'd stop in. Didn't stay. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find here. I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to see if it might be here. That bothers me. I have found my soul a bit twisted when I turn and realize that he wasn't here. Why today? Why this sermon? Did he show up? Did not stay? What was it in his life that wouldn't allow him to receive the grace in the way that we offer it here at our church? But it's the same way if we went to a Pentecostal church. And some of you have been in a Pentecostal church. I've been in a Pentecostal church. It's a hard place for me to be. It's not the grace isn't there, but it's not my language. So there's wanderers. There's always going to be wanderers. But we have a responsibility to represent the Father to anyone who walks in the door here. To celebrate. I think it's one reason why at this church, part of how we celebrate hospitality and fellowship here. But we have to be careful and remember that folks that walk in our door may never have received or known grace before, not love. They may have seen wrath, but never have received grace and don't know what to do with it. First time I encountered a Methodist church, a real Methodist church that had a real spirit of hospitality, I thought I was in a charismatic Methodist church. And I almost left. The only reason I didn't because all the kids were sitting on the front row, and I'd never seen a church where all the kids sat on the front row. As it turned out, they just loved Jesus. And they knew how to love strangers. And they were people who had taken enough of the inward journey to find God and figured out how to live out of that place entered into the holy place within to find the love that they had been looking for. One of my peculiar ways of seeing life is in the language of connecting dots. I'm not smart enough to invent dots, but I occasionally see dots that can relate to other dots. So my ministry is oftentimes a ministry of connecting dots. People that have certain gifts and graces, and I see certain needs in the church and opportunity, and so I'll start making conversations and phone calls and trying to be the source of the nudge once in a while for folks. There's a time and place in the lives of those who are passing from this world to the next. Some of you will have had this experience, this holy experience of being at the bedside of someone who's dying, someone who knows they're dying. There's a weariness that sets in at the end of life. Just a weariness. There just is nothing else to keep them here. I heard these words expressed from my own mom's mouth. I'm tired. I just want to go home. I just want to go home. And they're not talking back to the house. They're talking about home. We don't have to wait till we die to find that place. It's here. It's here. We just have the courage. It just takes the courage to look inside. So we'll be talking about connecting some dots over the next weeks in our holy fellowship of connecting dots. Using this parable and extraordinarily gifted artist of words in his own way of wrestling with his own emotions and feelings and those of the world around him, and somehow managing to paint word pictures that are as beautiful and overwhelming as a piece of art can be. On January 8th, these were the words that came as the daily devotion from Henry Now. And some of you, as I mentioned, have been following the devotions that I post on my Facebook page. Some of you responded to this posting. The title is that God needs me as much as I need God. It says, it might sound strange, Henry Nouwen writes, but God wants to find me as much as, if not more than, I want to find God. God is working harder to find us than we will ever work to find God. God needs me. God needs me. God needs you. God needs you. Needs you as much as any of us can ever need God. God's not that patriarch who stays home, doesn't move, expects his children to come to him, apologize for their aberrant behavior, beg for forgiveness, and promise to do better. On the contrary. To the contrary, the father leaves the house ignoring his dignity. And we're going to talk a lot about that in a week or two. God ignores his own dignity by running toward them, pays no heed to the apologies, pays no heed to the promises of change, and brings them to the table that he had richly prepared for them. Come. Eat. And he says, I'm beginning to see how radically the character of my spiritual journey will change when I no longer think of God as hiding out and making it as difficult as possible for me to find him, but instead, God simply being the one who's looking for me while I am doing the hiding. It is each of us who hides behind our own brokenness, our own unwillingness to change, our fear of that change, our indifference, just being stuck where we are, where we've been for a long time in journey. We talk a lot about that in my Threshold class, about getting stuck and how to get unstuck. I'm beginning to see how radically the character of my spiritual journey will change when I no longer think of God as hiding out and making it hard for me to find him, but instead understanding that God is the one who's looking for me and I'm the one who's hiding in the closet. So for the rest of January and February, we're going to step through this mysterious window that Nowen describes as this painting. Walk through the threshold within this parable to see what's on the other side. Walk through the parable to see who is on the other side. We will have two spiritual guides, Nowen and Rembrandt. So for 6 weeks, we'll be exploring a way of life that Nowen calls the way of the heart. The way of the heart. But that's another book of his for another time. So if you aren't home yet, don't be surprised when you are surprised by the Father who's looking for you. If you are home and have always been home but don't know the Father for who he could be for you, I pray that you will allow yourself to begin peeking through that curtain. Crack the door a bit and peek inside you and find there the God who's already there, opening our heart. Let God replace our resentment or our fear, our hurt, our indifference with God's saving, transforming love that we call God's amazing grace.